Peter, maybe we could start by you just telling us a little bit about your work, what you're doing in the field of entomology.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Peter Soroye. I'm a conservation biologist, and I study the impact of climate change and habitat loss on wildlife across the globe, but particularly on pollinators, and especially bumblebees and butterflies. So I use really big data sets to look across all of North America and Europe, and I look at how things like not only global warming, but climate chaos that comes with climate change. I look at how these things cause extinctions in different groups of species.
And I think all of us have read the headlines enough to know that the impact on pollinators is pretty severe, whether it's climate change or modern agricultural practices. Sometimes it's kind of scary actually to read some of the, at least the popularized versions of this. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about that? Like, what are you seeing in your research?
Yeah, yeah, and it is. It definitely can get a little depressing sometimes because you find these really dramatic declines. For example, we saw in a recent paper that came out in February of 2020 uh, that I led a study that I led. We found that the likelihood of finding a bumblebee, of going anywhere in North America on average and finding a bumblebee today versus 60 years ago, was about half as likely,
Hmm.
which was a huge decline, right? Like, and we found that this was related in particular to increasing extremes in temperature. So not only just temperatures gradually warming, but things like heat waves becoming stretching into weeks and lasting and becoming even hotter over time. So we're finding for bumblebees especially, which is a group that I mainly work with, a lot of these dramatic declines across Europe as well. Species are much less likely to be found today versus 50 or 60 years ago. So really dramatic declines over a short time period, and is strongly related to things like climate, but also things like agriculture, like you mentioned, and habitat loss and other things. Yeah.
I think I've seen that myself. I mean, I've always lived in the country, and I think I remember as a kid seeing a lot more bumblebees than I see now. So I like that.
Yeah.
That's kind of the lived experience, I think, of people. I,
Hmm.
I mean, I live in the country and I'm talking about the country, but of course, the work we do with MCM is mostly in inner city Montreal. So maybe the next
Hmm.
thing we could talk a little bit about is urban entomology, for lack of a better term. I mean, I think everybody's concerned about pollinators and bumblebees and butterflies and hoverflies and all of them. But how do you do entomology in an urban setting? Is there room for entomology in downtown Montreal?
I think so. Yeah, I live in downtown Ottawa, and I don't know if I would do professional. It's not professional collecting in the same sense of setting up moth traps in the middle of the woods or anything like that. But it's so what I love about kind of urban entomology, as you might call it, is just that it's purely curiosity based, right? It's harnessing, I think, the root of the beauty of science and discovery, and really the root of it is, or how I see it is, going around urban environments, whether it's parks, whether it's backyards, whether it's even sometimes in your own house, and just looking at the especially invertebrates or insects that you might see around there. And you'll be surprised. I found jumping spiders on my balcony 3 floors up. I'll be walking along the side of the road to school, to campus, and on a flower just see um, a really beautiful sweat bee, like a metallic green sweat bee, just hiding, nestling in the middle of the flower. So it's you'll be surprised what you can see even in the middle of the city, and if you're interested in saving it as well, making things like pollinator gardens, even in the middle of heavily urban environments, is something that can be really beneficial for pollinators, for even outside of insects, things like hummingbirds and other pollinators also visit those pollinator gardens.
So, another thing that you're involved with is, I don't know if you use this term, but it's the term that came to my mind, is this notion of citizen science, right? Where people like you, pros and researchers and people who've dedicated their lives to it, can connect with just ordinary folks who are out walking through the city, um, seeing things and noting things and recording things. Can you maybe talk a bit about citizen science and how that can help you in the work that you're doing in terms of understanding what's going on with big issues like climate change and the future of pollinators?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah. Citizen science, or sometimes we'll call it community science as well. But these things are I love them as a just as an individual. Before I was ever doing really intense research, I was like contributing to some of these programs like Eat Butterfly or iNaturalist. But the idea of it is so simple. It's scientists can only collect, or researchers can only collect so much data, can only visit so many places to look at what's there. And so, but there are thousands, millions of really interested people that might be willing to do this as well. And so community science harnesses the power of all of these interested people. And so through apps like iNaturalist, whenever you're outside, you can snap a picture of a bee or of a flower or of a neat mushroom or a bird that you saw. And all of this gets added to these global online repositories of data. And so researchers like myself, or like my lab members or others around the globe, can download this data. And so every observation that anybody makes through one of these community science apps, it contributes to researchers using this data to track how species are moving in response to climate change, how they're reacting to urbanization or pesticides or agriculture. And so all of this information that gets collected by people across the globe gets used in research and is actually incredibly useful. Um,
And so are there ways like who would we talk to in our at our local university or a nearby university about that? Do you just sort of like get in touch with them and say, hey, do you have any kind of community science programs going on?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there are a few just that just kind of float around in that just are kind of passive. Things like iNaturalist or eButterfly. These are apps on the phone or sites on the website where you just kind of log in what you see whenever you feel like it. But yeah, reaching out to if you're in Montreal, looking at people like Carly Zeder or other kind of urban ecologists or researchers that focus on either entomology or any kind of field, but that do work, especially in urban environments or more human environments. But museums as well is a great place or a great hub of a lot of these programs too. So I know the Montreal Insectarium as well. People like Dr. Maxime Lariviere are super also into these community science and citizen science programs, and always willing to engage with people outside.
Super. Now, we didn't plan this, but it turns out that we're talking on the morning of Monday, February 22nd, and this is the beginning of Black in Entomology Week, which is a kind of a North American wide, I guess maybe a worldwide phenomenon that's sort of coming together,
Mhm.
looking at, I guess, minority participation. I mean, it happens in other fields as well, but birding, I think, was one of the first ones to sort of launch this. But now, Black in entomology. Are you kind of part of that in some way? I mean, you are part of that in some way, but are you part of this kind of recognizing the week too?
Minorly, yeah. So the organizers, or a few of the really key organizers of this, are Professor Jessica Ware and Professor Mediana Andrade. Mediana Andrade is actually at University of Toronto, and so this was, yeah, kind of born out of last year with Black Birders Week in the summer. That was a huge event, highlighting just cool birds, and there's just a lot of cool information about birding, and it sparked this whole wave of different of being Black in different fields, because one of the things, um, minorities, Black people, people of color, Indigenous people have historically been excluded from a lot of fields of science.
Mhm.
And so now, as a result, like proportionally, you look at the demographics of people in undergrad, and then people in grad school, and people and professors and other research positions, and Black people, people of color, Indigenous people are dramatically underrepresented. So it's really great to have these weeks like Black in Entomology, where I get to meet other Black entomologists, and we get to share kind of a common experience and see the research we're doing. And so it's a really fantastic, I think, initiative. And mostly though, it's just cool because it's a chance to learn about all this really dope science
Yeah,
that goes on.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
Um,
but I'm sure too, one of the real, or one of the biggest interests, certainly I would think one of the biggest interests is also to encourage young people to
Hmm.
see themselves, as it were,
Yeah.
in these fields, and whether they're in a STEM program or they're just kind of like got this inkling that they'd like to do this kind of work, it makes
Hmm.
a difference that when you see people who visually are like you to do this. So I assume a
Yeah.
big piece of this is aimed at young folks.
It is, yeah, yeah. And I can say from experience as well, like when I first started university, I my goal was to be a medical doctor, because I knew Black people who were medical doctors, but I didn't know any Black people who were really interested in the outdoors, who were interested in entomology or in conservation. And it was only as I kind of, got further in my degree, I realized that I can't ignore the passion I have for conservation. And but I know if I had seen people who looked like me who were doing this sort of work, it would have been incredibly influential early on. So yeah, a lot of it is aimed towards the younger generation, the next generation of researchers and
Yeah.
scientists that's going to come in.
Hey, Peter, thanks so much for taking some time for us this morning.
Thank you so much, Royal, for having me. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Bye bye.
Yeah.